Amos did, and Micah, and all the other books of the Old Testament where the prophets have their own book. So we're going to enter into a time where it's really important that the prophets write their message down for posterity, so that people will realize that this calamity or calamities that's happening to them is not because God is weak, but because ultimately God is strong and he is holy. And he told them in advance in the law of Moses, if you bow down to idols and you reject me, these curses of the covenant of Deuteronomy 28 are going to come upon you. So the prophets come on the scene. And yes, oftentimes they would foretell the future, but not always. Primarily, the prophets were calling people back to the law that they had forgotten. Remember, Hosea says, my people perish for lack of knowledge. They stopped paying attention. They stopped studying. They didn't even know that they were, chosen people that were supposed to worship this God that's a spirit, and you don't worship him through a graven image like all the peoples around you. So the prophets were trying to reach the current generation, many times that were ignorant and hardened in sin, to try to get them to repent before it's too late. And then they would be reminded of all these curses of the covenant that would come upon them. God promised he would do this, and he's going to do it, because that's one thing you can count on God. He's not a liar. And so don't think you can just go on and on living your merry way and becoming like the Canaanites. There are going to be serious consequences. And one of the first consequences is you're not going to have a good crop yield. You're not going to have rain. You're not going to have bread. Yes, you're going to be starving to death. Now, keep that in mind. In fact, where's Gene? You got the verse there in Deuteronomy? What did Moses tell the people? Go ahead and read that.
This is 11:16.
Yeah, it is, let's see here, Deuteronomy 11, 16, and 17.
Beware that your hearts are not deceived, and that you do not turn away and serve other gods and worship them. Or the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens, so that there will be no rain, and the ground will not yield its fruit, and you will perish quickly from the good land which the Lord is giving you.
Okay, so there's not a problem with the land. Under normal circumstances, it's the land that flow with the milk and honey, right? And it's not a problem with Jehovah. In fact, Jehovah is doing this in an attempt to reaffirm his sovereignty and to get people to recognize who really is the true God. Because now the major competition to Jehovah is going to be Baal. And he's normally pictured with a thunderbolt in his hand, and sometimes in the other hand, some sort of reaper from the field, indicating he's sort of the god of harvest and rain. He's the storm god. So all these people that are worshiping Baal are worshiping the storm god. And so God says, good luck with that. So he sends Elijah to tell them in advance, I think after about 6 months of them already having trouble, so they're fervently praying to Baal. And Elijah says, this is really bad already. It's going to be gone in another 3 years. And then we'll see who the real storm god is. So that's the context here that's often overlooked. And the thing that ties all of these accounts together, it's really fascinating, and you'll see that I gave you these little, clips from the reading, and they all were picked because they all have reference to bread. See, if there's a famine, and it's been going on for years, and there's no wheat harvest, and bread is like the basic food stuff that keeps you alive, everybody's frantically looking for bread. And it specifically talks about that the royal family of Ahab and Jezebel were able, because they were wealthy and all that, could probably get some bread imported. So you had to choose to either trust in God, like Elijah models for us here, or you choose to seek bread from Jezebel's table. Who are you going to trust? Who are you going to believe? And the thing that's so fascinating is is that when the fire comes down from heaven, because the storm god's the one who would bring the thunder, right? The fire. And it comes, immediately, and all these other 450 prophets of Baal are completely humiliated. Shows who the real storm god is. And all the people are chanting, Elijah, he is God, Elijah, he is God. In the Hebrew, they would have been saying, Elijah, Elijah, Elijah. How appropriately was he named? And so Elijah thinks, okay, if anybody has any doubt about who's the real God and who's the real storm god, this just demonstrated it. Because after that incident, it's interesting, Elijah has to pray 7 times. He makes 7 specific requests. And then a little cloud comes up, and then it gets bigger, and it gets bigger, and it's bigger, and it just pours down rain. What a victorious moment. And the people are shouting, yep, Jehovah, he is God. Ahab and Jezebel are given irrefutable, miraculous evidence of who's true and who's false. Is that going to soften Jezebel's heart? Is that going to cause Ahab to think, man, I shouldn't have listened to this woman. She's got me into this big mess. I'm following the wrong God. Did that soften his heart at all? No, they're just determined to go about their merry way in spite of just unbelievable, irrefutable evidence. And they send people out to try to kill Elijah. And then he flees. But I just want you to realize, I call this Elijah the bread of life. And I think there's 2 really important spiritual lessons that we ought to get from this. We looked at how Ahab and Jezebel were so wicked, and they kind of, really typify what the people were like around them and what this period of apostasy was. And so, based on Deuteronomy 28, they don't have much time left. And so before they're taken into captivity, like they ultimately are promised would happen, Deuteronomy told them that I'm going to shut up the skies, and you're not going to have any rain, and you're not going to have any crops, and see how you like that. And it's particularly appropriate given that the storm god of the Phoenicians is the competition here. Remember, Jezebel wants to destroy all the prophets of Jehovah and destroy any true worship of Jehovah. They already had corrupted the worship by worshiping Jehovah through the golden calves. She wanted to stop all of that and just worship her God, the God from Sidon or from Phoenicia. And so God comes out and tries to see if he can get people to recognize, don't go this direction. Yes, this is going to be good for you economically. This is going to be good for you militarily. This is going to be good for your trade. The Phoenicians were like Great Britain was for so much of world history, just this great naval power. And talks about them, laying on beds of ivory. That would have been imported through the Phoenicians. And so, at any rate, it was a good move economically, but it drew people away from God. And again, they're trying to use human wisdom like Solomon did instead of depending upon their alliance with Jehovah. Now, this is a famous verse that is quoted a lot, and for good reason. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. The King James says, availeth much. That just sounds better to me because I'm just familiar with the King James Version. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much, or it is powerful and effective. Okay, that verse by itself is true, but what is the example that is given to prove this? Who's the prayer warrior that is given as a case in point? Elijah. When in doubt, just mention the character we're studying. Right? And probably other questions I'll ask tonight will be, Elijah, no reason to say that without confidence, folks. Okay, would someone like to read verses 17 and 18 of what he says after talking about the fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much? Go ahead, John. Good, thank you.
So,
go ahead.
17 and 18, you said?
Yes, please.
Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the earth for 3 years and 6 months. Then he prayed again, and the sky poured rain, and the earth produced its fruit.
Okay, so this example here of Elijah, telling them in advance that we're going to have 3 years of famine. And then there were 3 years of famine. And he tells them in advance so they won't be blaming Jehovah, because some of them may have been praying to Jehovah for rain. And the prophet from Jehovah says, no, you're going to have to be punished because you've been bowing down to Baal, the wrong god, the wrong storm god in particular. And then later on, he prays fervently. Now, it's interesting. He makes 7 requests. So that shows you that prayers have to be persistent, right? This isn't a cavalier thing. I mean, he's fervently praying. And then God brings about the rain right on time, just as he said it would, which proved to the people that he was a true spokesman of God. And so this example of praying for rain and it stopping and then it coming back with just a vengeance, in spite of the fact that the people were still bowing down to Baal. There were 7,000, remember, that he told Elijah had not yet bowed the knee. So there were some righteous grains of salt around there that God was very concerned about. So they were vindicated. And sadly, though, these other people were just hardened and going to go about their business in spite of clear evidence. And boy, I'll tell you what, that's a hardened heart. That's why the Hebrew writer talks about beware of the deceitfulness of sin, that it not harden your heart. And so this is a beautiful example of how this man Elijah, though God was working with him in a special way, what kind of a man does it say that he was? It's a man just like us, right? So in some ways, Elijah is going to prove to be a flawed man, and he's going to even be suicidal at one point and want to give up and all that stuff in chapter 19. But it ought to be reaffirming to us that God answered this man's prayer when it brought about his purpose and his will, and that God will answer our prayers in amazing ways as well. But he prayed nothing doubting. So this guy is the example of the powerful and effective prayer life that all of us should revel in and live in. All right, another important spiritual lesson is taken from John 4, and I preached on this just recently, where I talked about Jesus is the bread of life. And for those of you that were here, it was on a Sunday night, I talked about how when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, remember there's 2 words for life in the Greek. One is bios, like the biosphere or biology. The other is zoe, which has to do with the real abundant, eternal life, real life. And Jesus says, you're too busy looking for bread here, looking for your next meal. And he had fed the 5,000. So he had given them food, and so much so they were all stuffed and had 12 baskets left over. But then he reminds them that you're looking in the wrong place if all you think I should do is provide you for your physical needs. I can do better. I can provide you for your spiritual needs and give you basically eternal life and an abundant life. That's what you need to look for. I'm not just a part of the biosphere, I'm a part of heaven's sphere. And that's what you need to focus in on. And this account basically is a foreshadowing of that, because that's going to be the lesson with the widow at Zarephath. So what you have here really are 3 characters, and we'll look at each of those characters and how they all fit together in just a moment. But the end of this discussion is where Jesus proclaims that I am the bread of life. All right, somebody want to read verses 48 through 51? Okay, Les?
48.
Where he says,
I am the bread of life. Your forefathers ate the manna in the desert, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which a man may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world.
Okay. Let's jump ahead just for a minute because we don't have a lot of time in this class. You're familiar with the story, I'm sure, of the widow of Zarephath. And when she goes ahead and basically takes the last bit of oil and the last bit of bread that she had, she thought it was going to maybe be her last meal. Cupboard's bare. And she first does what Elijah says. Remember, the widow of Zarephath, who's another main character in all this, Zarephath is a city not in Israel, but from where? From Phoenicia. That's really important. Not just some miscellaneous widow. This woman was a woman who was in a country that had not been given any special promises, would not be that familiar at all with the law of Moses. In fact, she's actually not far from Sidon. This is Jezebel's territory. She is the daughter of the king of Sidon. So in this case, Elijah is sent up to Phoenicia, and here we find a land of total apostasy, total idolatry, and paganism. And she apparently had given up on Baal after almost 3.5 years. Duh. But she sees that Elijah is from the God of Israel, Jehovah. And so Elijah comes to her and says, okay, I'm hungry. Can you give me some bread and some water? Which is a big request when there has not been rain for almost 3.5 years. And so she puts her trust here in Elijah, though she's from Phoenicia. And she says, might as well, this is my son and I's probably last meal. I guess I'll trust in you now, see. And so she makes this meal for Elijah. And then Elijah basically says, because you trusted in me and you gave all that you had to me as a prophet of Jehovah, then you go back to your house and you're going to find that little jar where you got the oil and the place where you got, what little wheat you had, it's going to last you and your son throughout the rest of the famine. In other words, it's kind of like the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, which is what happened prior to the people following Jesus and then wanting more bread. And then he says, well, I'm the bread of life, and it's more than just physical things. So they get taken care of, and they miraculously, just like Jesus took 5 loaves and 2 fishes and fed 5,000 and more people, guess what happens here? You feed Elijah, she has nothing, puts her complete trust now in Jehovah, though she's probably been a lifetime Baal worshiper, and the miraculous incident occurs here where she has just continual daily bread, just doesn't ever run out. Happens on several occasions in the Kings. It's really fascinating. And so she's all happy, right? And says, wow, this is really something. But then what happens? Her son, who now had plenty to eat, nonetheless gets sick and dies. And then she gets really upset and said, has this been some cruel trick? I did what you asked and I trusted in you. And then look at this, your God come to punish me because I'm from Zarephath? Like I'm your enemy? And Elijah says, no, you've shown great faith. And so he goes in and he lays on top of her son. And what happens? Yes, suddenly he starts breathing again. And he goes out to the woman and he says, the breath of life is within him once again. The word there is spirit. And so then she says, now I know that thou art the true God. After she realized that he wasn't just someone that could provide her for physical needs, but that Jehovah had something more important involved, not just being the true storm God, but the God that could take care of the soul, which is what Jesus is saying is I'm the bread of Zoe, the bread of spiritual life. So these lessons are really important, and they kind of tie together. And Elijah is the bread of life, and that's the theme throughout all of these different accounts. And as I said, there's three main characters. The first is Elijah, the true believer who trusts in God, and God provides him with bread in the midst of the famine. In fact, he had told them there wouldn't be much crops because you don't have any rain. So he's the one who predicted this. In fact, in the text, Ahab is trying to blame Elijah for the lack of rain. And in a sense, you could say, well, yeah, he predicted it, but then he's going to show that this was a punishment, and that any time you really turn to the true God instead of Baal, you can get the rain and the crops that you so much desire. So he's the true believer, and it's an example how he trusts in God. So he tells him to go over to the brook Cherith, and he's able to have some food there because that brook for a while is fine. But then the famine is so severe that the brook dries up. And so now what happens? You know, when wicked people bring a curse upon a nation, sadly, a lot of the righteous people have to suffer because of all the wickedness around them. That's really sad. But that happens. And so Elijah has to suffer. So he is told that don't worry about it. How's he going to be fed? Morning and afternoon, the ravens are going to come and feed him. And so God's going to provide him the bread. And then when the brook dries up, then he's told to go to Phoenicia, of all places, to find bread. And God puts him in touch with this widow. So Elijah's the true believer, wavers here and there, especially after Jezebel turns on him and tries to kill him, and the people don't really support him like they should have. So he gets very, very depressed. But what's the first thing that God tells him to do when he's saying, just go ahead and take my life, I give up. After all of this, if the people won't repent, there's no hope. He says, arise and eat. So God provides him with bread and gives him something to drink and has an angel involved. So God is proving again, he's the real bread of life. He's the one that can sustain you both spiritually and, of course, physically. And so then Elijah is told all these different things that he has to do, and God still has a purpose for him. And, of course, part of that is going to be the apprentice for Elisha. I want you to pick out your replacement. And eventually, how is Elijah going to exit this earth? There's only one other person that got out of this world alive. Yeah, Enoch, God took him. And Elijah is able to be ascended up into heaven by a whirlwind. But as he's leaving, he drops his cloak upon Elisha. And I just love this. What does Elisha ask for as this great man of God is his mentor? And now he's got you talk about filling big shoes. He's got to fill the shoes of Elijah, which I think he does really well. And he's going to wind up performing even more miracles than Elijah did. And that's partially because of his request of Elijah in another prayer that God answered. He says, I want a double portion of what God gave you. And of course, it wasn't selfish. He wanted to be a great prophet and maybe call people back in a way that he would be successful, maybe spare the nation from oblivion. I mean, the stakes were high. So yeah, Elijah, you've been mentoring me, and you're being rewarded by actually being caught up into heaven without death. But I want double what you have. And God's going to give Elisha the double spirit, which is why all these amazing miracles follow. But for the most part, in spite of all of these miracles that God gave Elijah and Elisha, the people, even those who witnessed the miracles, what's their reaction going to be? We just want to continue in our lifestyle. We want to continue in our sin. I mean, you would think you would get some attention by the miracles that they performed. Some, but not enough for the nation to repent. Jim, did you have a question?
Lazarus was taken up. Rich man and Lazarus, he was taken up into Abraham's bosom.
Oh, sure.
The presence of God, yeah.
Yeah.
And Lazarus taken away from
Well, no, not quite the same.
Yeah, but
Lazarus was raised from the dead. There are other folks. The widow at Nain in Jesus' day, this widow of Zarephath was raised from the dead. Raised from the dead is different from never dying at all. So that's Enoch and Elijah. Okay? All right, so Elijah's the true believer, the man of faith. Though he wavers, God continues to bless him and use him. And remember, he is a man just like you and I are. If we have that sense of belief that God is working in our lives and can use us in a great way, even during a time of wickedness, which certainly is the day we're living in. All right, then you got this widow who initially is a non-believer from a foreign nation, but she's going to put her faith in Jehovah. It will be blessed. And then because of the resurrection of her son, she's going to say, now I know that you're the true God. So who is it that is confessing belief in Jehovah? A non-Israelite. But the Israelites, for the most part, are not going to. That happened in Jesus' day too, didn't it? On several occasions, he'd see somebody that was a centurion and a Gentile, and they heard about Jesus, and they came and asked him questions, and he says, behold, your faith I have not seen, even in Israel. You would think faith would come first to the Israelites and to the Jewish people who had all this heritage. But even in Jesus' day, there was widows like the widow at Zarephath who were Gentiles and would confess faith and show more interest in Jesus than the Jews did. So that's maybe kind of a little bit of a foreshadowing there also. And by the way, when she says, now I know, because her son was raised from the dead, what is it that caused Thomas to confess my Lord and my God? Yeah, when he sees for sure, with empirical evidence, he can put his own hands into the nail prints of the scars that were upon Jesus, and he says, my Lord and my God. And then he reminds us in the narrative that more blessed are those who believe yet have not actually seen with their own eyes, who believe by faith. And that's you and me. Yes, Gene?
Peter made the same kind of exclamation in Acts 10
He did.
after a miracle.
Yeah, of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. Exactly right. So you got the true believer who trusts in God, the widow, this non-believer who comes around based on the miracles. And all of this is in contrast to Ahab and Jezebel, especially Ahab, who should have known better. I mean, who put Omri on the throne? Jehovah did. His father was someone that, God had hoped maybe would turn things around. But instead, he just followed in the calf worship. And then his son Ahab marries somebody as wicked as Jezebel and allows himself to be manipulated by this apostate from a foreign country. And he basically converts to the Phoenician god. Well, how, Dr. Phil, people would come and talk about their problems, and he'd stop and he'd say, how's that working for you? And I want to look around at this famine and all this trouble and go, this turning away from Jehovah and worshiping Baal, how's that working for you? Why don't you pray a little bit more to the storm god and see what he does for you? And I just love how in the contest that Elijah sets up with the 400 prophets of Baal, they keep on asking for all 450 of them for fire to come down from heaven and burn up the sacrifice and prove who's the real God of thunder, God of fire, and God of rain. And of course, nothing happens. So as was typical of, the pagans, they would cut themselves and cry out and be bleeding, and they'd be trying to get the pagan gods' attention because that's the way they viewed their gods. All the sexual activity associated with the worship of pagan gods was all about trying to please them and get their attention. And they believed that if they pleased the gods, then they'd get these bountiful crops. And so I just love where Elijah kind of sits back and toys with them, kind of makes fun of them. And he says, maybe you need to yell a little louder. Maybe he's on a journey and he can't hear you. Maybe, he just goes on and on and on. All the people are hearing this. And they're just so frustrated, and they go on and on and on, and he says, okay, you done? And then after they had all the time they wanted, and all these many attempts, and after being mocked by Elijah, then Elijah goes and says, just to make sure that you're not going to think something's fishy here, what does he do to the altar of Jehovah? Yeah, I think 3 different buckets of water he pours on this. Well, if you're trying to get the thing to light fire, that's the last thing you want to do. But this was to show the power of Jehovah and that he truly is the storm god and ultimately the I am that I am, the one that always has been and always will be. And so he just asked one time for the fire to come down and just consume the sacrifice. And what happens? Boom, it comes down immediately, and it laps up all the water, and there's this huge fire, and the crowd just breaks out cheering, Elijah, Elijah, Elijah. Jehovah, he is God. What a great moment. And just as Elijah is at the ultimate peak of his success and thinking that he had succeeded in getting the people to believe, what happens? Jezebel and her representatives that are there just get mad, and they send out messengers to kill Elijah. So then he's got a 17-mile trip to where he winds up. He's just exhausted, running for his life. And he's thinking, here, I've trusted in Jehovah. We've done all these great things. And here, I'm the one that has to run for my life. I've got nothing but the shirt on my back. So he's exhausted, and he says some things that he's going to regret. And he's basically ready to give up. And that's where God does something really amazing. He says, I want you to find out how I communicate, how I speak to you. And you remember, he said, now, there's this earthquake. Go over and see what I've said to you in this earthquake. No, nothing there. Then there's this big fire, nothing there. A big wind, nothing there. And then God spoke to him in a still small voice. And that's the way God appeared to him. What do you think was the point behind that message? And what lesson can we learn from the still small voice example?
God doesn't need to do much.
Okay, he doesn't always, this example up on Mount Carmel and the fire coming down and this unbelievable miracle, that's pretty stupendous and extremely, awe-inspiring. And sometimes God does act in ways like that. But perhaps more often, when people have faith, he comes to them in more subtle ways and in ways that are not quite so irrefutable to the skeptic, but things that we might know in our own hearts is the way we're being directed. And so some scholars say instead of still small voice, they say a quiet whisper. There's interesting different ways in which it's translated. But I think it's a reminder that though God worked in that way here, and it should have impacted Ahab and Jezebel, it didn't. And it had very little impact also upon the people. But Elijah was reminded that, yeah, I'm going to continue to work in your life, but don't expect another Mount Carmel. So I think that's pretty cool. You know, a lot of people, I'm amazed that people, sometimes go, well, they're studying the New Testament in there, and they're studying the Kings over there in the overflow room, if you want to go there. And not many people choose here. But you guys have, thank you. Because, the Kings especially has a bad rap. Oh, that's so boring. I think it's anything but boring. I mean, there's some of the most amazing lessons here, especially about God's patience and his long suffering, but how ultimately, even after warnings, he's eventually going to bring about judgment, and we better be ready. And that's true personally, but these things are national judgments. And as our nation becomes more and more wicked and more immoral and turns more and more away from God, in spite of irrefutable evidence that what they're doing is not in the society's best interest, they don't care. I mean, all this stuff about 57 different genders and all this craziness that's going on, and now they're talking about men having babies. And Gail was reading me something about the CDC's come out with some guidelines for men to chest feed infants. What is wrong with these people? Sorry, men don't have babies, women do. I mean, just promoting what they want to be true in spite of overwhelming evidence. And then if you try to talk to them about it, they just kill the messenger, accuse you of being guilty of hate or being a bigot or something. And it's exactly what we find happening here when they refuse to accept the truth that, no, the God of Israel is really the true God, not the God of Phoenicia. And here, even a Phoenician widow confesses belief, while most of the Israelites will not. So, this was written so people in captivity could understand why they're in the mess they're in. So, if you're in captivity and you're in a society where when you fight battles with other nations, you assume that if you win, that means your God is superior to the God of the nation you conquered. That's why it's so important you have all these written prophecies where people can see, no. This isn't because Jehovah is weak and he's not a God we should follow. We should follow another God that's more powerful. No. This is from God because we're unique as a people and God expects us to be holy, and he warned us about this. So don't misinterpret history and think that this is a way or a reason to turn away from God. This is the reason why you need to turn back to God, because he's your only hope. So that's a part of why we're being told this. And can't you imagine the next generation in captivity reading this, just being so frustrated with Ahab for selling out to the Phoenicians and for your ancestors refusing to repent after giving all these opportunities. So this is all about bread. And ultimately, God is the provider. Okay. Well, thank you all. I appreciate your being here. And we're going to look next week. What's the schedule for next week? We're going to look for a few minutes at Elisha. What's it say? Oh, right. Yeah, we're going to look at Elisha's miracles and especially look at Naaman in 2 Kings chapter 5. That's right. And boy, that's a lesson that has a lot of important doctrinal truths associated with it. So read 2 Kings chapter 5. We'll have time for discussion about Naaman and what kind of present lessons we can learn from him. Thank you very much.